In the summer of 1944, something was happening in France that seemed almost impossible. The German army had spent years building defenses across Western Europe. It had experienced officers. It had battle-hardened formations. It had machine guns, artillery, tanks, mines, fortified positions, and a doctrine designed to slow an Allied invasion to a crawl. And yet, only weeks after D-Day, American soldiers were beginning to move across France at a speed that surprised even some of their Allied partners. British and Canadian forces were fighting a brutal battle around Caen. The Americans were fighting through the hedgerows of Normandy. Everywhere, German units were trying to create defensive lines. But once the American breakout began, the battlefield changed. Towns fell. Road junctions disappeared from German control. Supply routes were cut. German formations were forced to retreat. And American columns began moving farther and farther into France. To understand why this happened, we have to go back to the beginning. Because the story isn't simply about American soldiers being faster. It wasn't one secret weapon. It wasn't one brilliant general. And it wasn't because German soldiers suddenly forgot how to fight. The real explanation was far more powerful. The American army had built an entire system designed to keep moving. Its logistics, its transportation, its artillery, its air support, its communications, its armored units, its engineers, its replacement system, and, most importantly, its ability to turn enormous industrial resources into battlefield momentum. The Germans had learned how to fight wars of movement. The Americans had learned how to sustain them. And in France, that difference became impossible to ignore. The army that crossed an ocean. In 1944, the United States was fighting thousands of miles from home. That fact alone was extraordinary. American soldiers had crossed the Atlantic. American equipment had crossed the Atlantic. American fuel had crossed the Atlantic. American ammunition had crossed the Atlantic. Even food, vehicles, spare parts, medical supplies, radios, uniforms, and engineering equipment had to make the journey. The United States had transformed itself into what was effectively a giant military production machine. Factories produced trucks. Factories produced tanks. Factories produced aircraft. Factories produced artillery shells. Factories produced radios. Factories produced engines. And behind all of it was an enormous transportation network. The American soldier arriving in Normandy was not fighting alone. Behind him was an industrial system stretching from France to Britain, across the Atlantic, and ultimately back to American factories. That mattered because modern warfare depended on something far less glamorous than courage. It depended on fuel. A tank without fuel was a bunker. A truck without fuel was useless. An artillery battery without ammunition was little more than a collection of heavy metal. A rifleman without food could not keep fighting. The United States understood this problem on a massive scale. The goal was not simply to get soldiers into France. The goal was to keep an army moving once it got there. And that distinction would become critical. D-Day did not create the breakout. When American troops landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, they did not immediately race across France. In fact, the first phase of the campaign was painfully slow. The beaches were only the beginning. Beyond them stood Normandy. And Normandy was a nightmare for mechanized warfare. The countryside was divided by hedgerows. These weren't simple garden fences. Many were thick banks of earth covered with vegetation. Some had existed for centuries. They created natural defensive walls. German troops could hide behind them. Machine guns could cover narrow openings. Mortars could strike advancing infantry. Tanks had difficulty seeing over the banks. American vehicles could become trapped in enclosed fields. The landscape forced soldiers to fight one small piece of ground at a time. And the Germans understood exactly how to use it. For weeks, American forces fought their way forward. The progress was measured in yards, sometimes in feet. Every field could become a battlefield. Every village could become a strong point. Every road could be covered by artillery. The American army was powerful. But power did not automatically equal speed. The battlefield had to be opened. And that required enormous sacrifice. The Hedgerow War. American infantrymen quickly learned one of the harshest lessons of Normandy. The enemy was often invisible. A German machine gun could be positioned behind a hedgerow. A sniper could disappear into vegetation. A mortar crew could fire and relocate. A concealed anti-tank gun could wait until an American tank entered the perfect range. The American response was adaptation. Soldiers began developing methods for breaking through the hedgerows. Tank crews modified their vehicles. Engineers cleared obstacles. Infantry and armor learned to work more closely together. Commanders studied the terrain. And the Americans began finding ways to turn the hedgerows from an advantage for the Germans into an obstacle the Germans themselves could not escape. But something else was happening. The American army was learning. Every battle created information. Every mistake became a lesson. Every successful tactic was passed to another unit. This was one of the hidden strengths of the American military system. It could absorb battlefield experience and distribute it. A soldier might arrive in Normandy inexperienced, but his division was not necessarily inexperienced. It contained officers and non-commissioned officers who had trained for years. It had doctrine. It had communications. It had artillery procedures. It had logistics. And it had access to commanders who could learn from what was happening. The American army was becoming more efficient as the campaign continued. Why the British experience was different. British forces had been fighting Germany for years. By 1944, Britain had enormous experience in modern warfare. British soldiers had fought in North Africa. They had fought in Italy. They had fought in the Middle East. They had fought in campaigns against German and Italian forces across multiple theaters. British commanders understood armored warfare. They understood artillery. They understood logistics. They understood the German army. But Britain had one major limitation. It had been fighting since 1939. The United Kingdom had spent years mobilizing its resources. Its economy was under enormous pressure. Its manpower was limited compared with the United States. British commanders therefore often had to think carefully about preserving combat power. The American army had a different problem. It had enormous resources but less accumulated battlefield experience at the beginning of the European campaign. America's challenge was turning industrial strength into combat effectiveness. By 1944, that transformation had accelerated dramatically. The Americans were no longer simply an army that had arrived in Europe. They were becoming an army that could operate continuously. And that was the key. The power of the truck. If there was one machine that symbolized the American advance across France, it wasn't the Sherman tank. It was the truck. The American army depended heavily on trucks. Thousands upon thousands of them. They carried ammunition. They carried fuel. They carried food. They carried spare parts. They carried engineers. They moved artillery. They evacuated wounded soldiers. They transported replacement troops. They carried everything an army needed to survive. This created something that German commanders increasingly struggled to match: mobility. American units could move supplies forward. Then they could move more supplies. Then even more. A division could advance while its supply system followed. Roads became arteries. Truck columns became lifelines. And every mile the army advanced, logistics personnel worked behind the front to keep the system functioning. The average American rifleman might never see the men responsible for this system, but he depended on them. The truck driver moving ammunition at night. The mechanic repairing a damaged engine. The fuel handler filling jerry cans. The engineer repairing a bridge. The quartermaster organizing supplies. The medical personnel moving wounded soldiers toward treatment. The army's speed was not created only at the front. It was created behind the front. Red Ball Express. Then came one of the most famous logistics operations of the campaign. The Red Ball Express. As American forces broke out of Normandy, the roads ahead became critical. Railways were damaged. Ports were not yet fully available. Supply dumps had to be moved. The front was moving faster than traditional supply systems could easily follow. The answer was a massive truck network. Beginning in August 1944, thousands of trucks were organized into a dedicated supply route system. Drivers moved ammunition, fuel, food, and other supplies toward the rapidly advancing armies. They drove enormous distances. They operated under difficult conditions. They faced traffic jams. They faced damaged roads. They faced mechanical breakdowns. And some drivers operated around the clock. The Red Ball Express was not the only reason the American army advanced, but it illustrated the larger American advantage. The army had enough trucks to make logistics itself a weapon. And when an army can continuously deliver supplies to advancing units, speed becomes possible. The Sherman wasn't the super tank. Popular history sometimes focuses heavily on tanks. But the American advance cannot be explained by saying the Sherman was simply better than every German tank. It wasn't. German tanks such as the Panther and Tiger could be extremely dangerous. They had powerful guns and heavy armor. American tank crews knew this. But the American approach was different. The Sherman was produced in enormous numbers. It was mechanically practical. It could be transported. It could be repaired. It could be supplied. And there were enough of them to equip large armored formations. The American army did not need every tank to be individually superior. It needed an armored force that could function as part of a larger system. That system included artillery, infantry, engineers, tank destroyers, air support, reconnaissance, maintenance, fuel, communications, and replacement vehicles. A German tank might defeat an American tank in a direct confrontation, but the battlefield was rarely a series of isolated tank duels. The American advantage was systemic. One tank could be knocked out, another could replace it, a damaged vehicle could be recovered, a mechanic could repair it, a supply truck could bring fuel, an artillery battery could support the next attack. The machine kept moving. Artillery, the American hammer. If the truck was the bloodstream of the American army, artillery was one of its most powerful weapons. American forces made extensive use of artillery, but the important part wasn't simply the number of guns. It was the ability to coordinate them. American artillery units developed sophisticated communication and fire control procedures. Forward observers could call for fire. Radio networks connected units. Artillery headquarters could coordinate batteries. Multiple batteries could concentrate their fire. This meant that an American infantry unit encountering strong resistance did not necessarily have to destroy the position alone. It could request artillery, and artillery could reshape the battlefield. German soldiers learned to respect American artillery. The shells could arrive quickly. They could strike defensive positions. They could disrupt movement. They could suppress machine guns. They could destroy vehicles. They could force German troops underground. Then American infantry could advance. This was combined arms. And combined arms created momentum. Air power over France. Then there was the sky. By the summer of 1944, Allied air superiority over Western Europe was overwhelming. American and British aircraft could operate across large areas of France. Fighter bombers attacked German transportation. They struck railways. They attacked bridges. They targeted road movement. They hit concentrations of troops and vehicles. The Germans increasingly found it difficult to move during daylight without being detected. This created a devastating problem. An army needs movement. German formations needed to move reinforcements. They needed ammunition. They needed fuel. They needed replacement vehicles. They needed to withdraw from threatened positions. But Allied aircraft made movement dangerous. The American ground army therefore had an enormous advantage. Its enemy could not move freely. The Americans could. And speed is relative. An army doesn't have to move incredibly fast if its enemy is barely able to move at all. The German problem. The German army in France was not weak simply because its soldiers were poorly trained. In many cases, German soldiers remained extremely capable. Some units had combat experience that exceeded that of many American formations. German officers could be aggressive and tactically skilled. German machine gun teams could be deadly. German artillery could still cause enormous casualties. German armored units could deliver devastating counterattacks. The problem was that Germany was fighting a war it could no longer supply effectively. The Normandy campaign had consumed enormous resources. Vehicles were damaged. Fuel was scarce. Aircraft were limited. Rail lines were destroyed. Allied bombing had disrupted transportation. German replacements were increasingly difficult to provide. And the German High Command was dealing with a larger strategic disaster. The Western Allies were advancing. The Soviets were advancing from the east. Germany was being crushed between two enormous fronts. France was no longer a secure battlefield. It was becoming a trap. The breakout. Then, in late July 1944, the American breakout began to accelerate. The breakthrough around St. Lo opened opportunities. Operation Cobra was designed to break through the German defensive system and exploit the gap. American forces attacked. German positions were overwhelmed. Once the front began to collapse, American mobility became extremely important. Units that had spent weeks fighting for small pieces of ground suddenly had space. Roads opened. Fields opened. German formations began withdrawing. American armored and motorized units pushed forward. The war was changing from a slow infantry battle into a war of movement. And this was where the American system became especially dangerous. Patton enters the story. One of the commanders most closely associated with the rapid American advance was General George S. Patton Jr. Patton believed in aggressive movement. He understood the psychological effect of speed. If an enemy was already retreating, give him no time to reorganize. If a road was open, use it. If a flank was exposed, attack it. If German forces were withdrawing, pursue them. Patton's Third Army became famous for its rapid movement across France. But it is important not to turn Patton into a superhero. The Third Army did not move quickly because one general simply shouted, "Advance." Its speed depended on divisions, corps headquarters, regiments, battalions, tank crews, truck drivers, engineers, artillery, air support, and thousands of ordinary soldiers. Patton's aggressive command style took advantage of a military machine that was capable of supporting rapid operations. Without that machine, aggressive orders would have produced empty roads and stranded tanks. The American Division. The American Infantry Division was another major part of the story. It was designed to operate with substantial organic support. Infantry regiments could coordinate with artillery. Engineers could support movement. Reconnaissance elements could identify enemy positions. Medical units could evacuate casualties. Signal units maintained communications. Transportation units moved supplies. The division was not simply thousands of riflemen. It was a miniature military ecosystem. This allowed commanders to make decisions while remaining connected to the resources needed to execute them. When a road needed to be repaired, engineers could act. When artillery was required, batteries were available. When ammunition ran low, transportation networks could replenish it. When soldiers were wounded, medical services could move them. This integration was one of the reasons the American Army could maintain momentum. Communications changed the battlefield. Another advantage was communication. Radios were becoming increasingly important. Commanders could communicate with subordinate units. Artillery could communicate with observers. Tank units could coordinate. Air and ground forces could share information. The result was a battlefield that was increasingly connected. A German unit might be hidden behind a defensive line. But if American reconnaissance discovered it, information could travel quickly. Then artillery could respond. Then infantry could move. Then armor could exploit the opening. The battlefield became a network. Speed was not only physical, it was informational. The faster an army could identify a problem, make a decision, and deliver force against it, the faster it could move. Why German retreats became so difficult? A retreat is one of the hardest operations in warfare. An army must withdraw without turning the movement into a rout. Rear guards must protect the main force. Bridges must be crossed. Vehicles must be moved. Wounded soldiers must be evacuated. Supplies must be transported. New defensive positions must be established. And all of this must happen while the enemy is attacking. For German forces in France, the problem became increasingly severe. American forces were attacking from multiple directions. British and Canadian forces were applying pressure farther north. Allied aircraft were striking transportation. The French countryside was hostile to German movement. The German command structure was struggling with conflicting orders. And Hitler repeatedly interfered with operational withdrawals. German commanders often wanted to retreat to preserve their forces. But orders from above could require them to hold positions. When those positions finally collapsed, the retreat was even more difficult. The Falaise Pocket. The crisis reached a dramatic point in August 1944. German forces in Normandy were becoming trapped. The Allied armies were closing around them. American forces advanced from the south and west. British and Canadian forces pressed from the north. The German army attempted to escape, but the window was closing. The resulting fighting around the Falaise Pocket became one of the decisive moments of the Normandy campaign. Large numbers of German troops were killed, wounded, or captured. Thousands escaped, but they left behind enormous quantities of equipment, vehicles, artillery, supplies, and the remnants of formations that had once represented a major German defensive force in Normandy. The significance was larger than the territory captured. The German army had lost the ability to organize an effective defense in Normandy. Now France lay open. France becomes a highway. After the breakout, the American advance began to look dramatically different. In Normandy, soldiers had fought for individual fields. Now entire towns were falling. American columns moved along roads. Armored formations advanced. Infantry followed. Engineers repaired bridges. Supply trucks followed behind. French civilians emerged from homes. In many places, American soldiers were greeted as liberators. But the battlefield remained dangerous. German units could still launch ambushes. Snipers remained a threat. Small German groups could establish roadblocks. Bridges could be destroyed. Fuel shortages could stop American units. The advance was fast, but it wasn't effortless. It was a race against logistics. And eventually, logistics would become the enemy of speed. The myth of an unstoppable American advance. There is a temptation to imagine that American forces simply raced across France without resistance. That is not what happened. The advance slowed. Units became exhausted. Vehicles required maintenance. Fuel consumption increased. Ammunition had to be transported enormous distances. Roads became congested. German forces still fought. The further American forces moved from Normandy, the longer the supply lines became. This created a paradox. The same army that had enabled rapid movement was now struggling to feed it. The trucks could move supplies forward, but they could not create fuel. They could not instantly create ammunition. They could not magically reopen every port. The farther the army moved, the greater the logistical burden became. Eventually, the American advance would slow dramatically. But before that happened, the speed of the breakout had already changed the war. The human side of speed. For a soldier on the ground, rapid advance did not necessarily feel heroic. It could feel exhausting. Imagine spending weeks fighting through Normandy, then suddenly being ordered to march farther, and farther, and farther. You might sleep in a ditch, eat from a ration, ride in a truck, walk beside a tank, move through a French village, then receive orders to keep moving. The enemy might be retreating, but that didn't make the journey safe. German artillery could still fire. Snipers could still hide. Mines could still be present. A soldier might have no idea how far the army had advanced. He simply knew that tomorrow he would move again. The speed visible on a map was created by thousands of exhausted human beings. The American replacement system. Another important factor was manpower. The United States could replace losses on a scale Germany increasingly could not. This did not mean American soldiers were disposable. Far from it. But the American army had a large manpower pool. Training centers in the United States had been preparing soldiers for overseas service. Replacement depots in Europe could send men forward. This allowed formations to recover from losses. Germany faced a different problem. Its manpower reserves were increasingly strained. By 1944, Germany was mobilizing men from older and younger age groups. Units often had to fight with reduced strength. Experienced soldiers were difficult to replace. When experienced non-commissioned officers and officers were lost, rebuilding unit effectiveness became difficult. The Americans could lose men and continue operating. Germany increasingly struggled to do the same. Industrial warfare. The deeper story is therefore industrial. World War II was not only a contest between soldiers. It was a contest between production systems. How many trucks could you build? How much fuel could you produce? How many artillery shells could you manufacture? How many aircraft could you build? How quickly could you replace losses? How much food could you transport? How many radios could you supply? The United States had enormous industrial capacity. Germany had tremendous industrial capabilities too. But Germany was under attack from the air. Its transportation system was being destroyed. Its access to raw materials was increasingly restricted. Its manpower was under pressure. Its factories were dispersed and bombed. And Germany was fighting a two-front war. America, meanwhile, could draw on an enormous industrial base protected by oceans. That industrial advantage eventually appeared on the battlefield as something very simple. More trucks, more ammunition, more fuel, more replacement equipment, more aircraft, more supplies. The French roads. There was another advantage that became increasingly important. France had roads. The German army had used them. The Allies used them. American truck columns depended on them. Once the Germans were forced into retreat, roads became routes for pursuit. But roads could also become bottlenecks. A destroyed bridge could stop an entire column. A destroyed road could create traffic jams. Engineers therefore became essential. American engineers worked constantly to keep the army moving. They repaired roads. They constructed crossings. They cleared obstacles. They restored infrastructure. The engineer with a bridge-building machine could be just as important to the advance as the infantryman with a rifle. Because an army that cannot cross a river cannot advance. An army that cannot cross a destroyed bridge cannot chase a retreating enemy. Mobility was a collective achievement. The French resistance. The Allied advance also benefited from the French resistance. Resistance groups gathered information. They disrupted German transportation. They attacked communication lines. They helped Allied intelligence. They sometimes guided Allied personnel. The resistance did not single-handedly defeat the German army, but it created another layer of pressure. German commanders had to worry not only about Allied aircraft and ground forces, They also faced an increasingly hostile environment behind their lines. Railways could be sabotaged. Telephone lines could be cut. Movement could be observed. Information could reach Allied forces. The German occupation system was collapsing as the Allied armies advanced. The psychological effect: speed has a psychological effect. An army that believes it can retreat to the next defensive line may remain organized. But if the enemy reaches that defensive line before you can establish it, panic can spread. Then another road is lost. Another bridge is lost. Another headquarters is abandoned. Another supply depot must be evacuated. The retreat accelerates. This is one of the most important reasons American mobility mattered. The Americans weren't merely capturing ground. They were reducing German options. Every mile forward could make the German position worse. Every road junction captured could cut movement. Every bridge secured could open another route. Every German formation forced to retreat had less time to reorganize. Speed became a weapon. Why the British and Americans moved differently. The phrase "British officers couldn't explain" needs some context. British commanders were not literally incapable of understanding American operations. British officers understood the American system very well. The more accurate point is that the scale and speed of American movement could be surprising even to experienced Allied observers. The British and Canadians faced some of the strongest German resistance around Cannes. Their battlefield conditions were different. German armored forces were concentrated against them. The terrain and operational situation differed. Meanwhile, after the American breakout, the German defenses in the West began to unravel. The result was a contrast. One part of the Allied front could appear almost stuck. Another could suddenly be moving dozens of miles. This wasn't because one army was brave and the other wasn't. It was because commanders were operating under different circumstances. But the American ability to exploit an opening was undeniable. The Third Army's race. Patton's Third Army became famous for its speed. Once it entered the breakout phase, American units moved rapidly through Brittany and across northern France. Some formations covered remarkable distances. They captured towns before German commanders expected them to arrive. They bypassed some resistance rather than stopping to destroy every enemy position. That was important. An advancing army doesn't always need to destroy every enemy soldier. Sometimes it needs to get around him. A German strongpoint might remain behind the front. If it was isolated, it could be dealt with later. This approach preserved momentum. The Americans were increasingly treating the German army not as a wall that had to be smashed everywhere, but as a system that could be penetrated, bypassed, isolated, and destroyed. That was operational mobility. The role of reconnaissance. You cannot move quickly if you don't know where you're going. Reconnaissance therefore mattered enormously. Scouts, armored reconnaissance units, aircraft, maps, local information, captured documents, reports from French civilians. All of these sources helped commanders understand the battlefield. A road that looked open on a map could contain German resistance. A bridge might be destroyed. A village might contain enemy armor. A crossroads could be undefended. The army that identified these differences faster could move faster. American reconnaissance helped commanders find openings. And when an opening appeared, units were ready to exploit it. The importance of small unit leaders. History often remembers generals. But rapid movement depended heavily on junior leaders. Lieutenants, captains, sergeants, tank commanders, squad leaders. These men made decisions in seconds. A road was blocked. A bridge was damaged. A German machine gun opened fire. A tank broke down. A radio stopped working. A platoon had to choose whether to continue or wait. The Army's doctrine encouraged initiative within the chain of command. Not every decision had to travel all the way back to headquarters. That mattered in a rapidly changing battlefield. Speed of command could be as important as speed of vehicles. The German army's experience became a trap. There is an interesting irony here. Germany had spent years developing highly effective methods of mobile warfare. In Poland, in France, in North Africa, against the Soviet Union. German forces had demonstrated operational mobility. But by 1944, Germany was no longer the side with freedom of movement. Its doctrine could not overcome the strategic situation. You can have excellent tactics and still lose the war. A German tank commander might make the correct tactical decision. A German infantry unit might fight brilliantly. A German officer might organize a successful defense. But if the next day's ammunition never arrives, the victory cannot continue. This is the difference between tactical skill and strategic capacity. The Americans increasingly had both the battlefield tools and the resources to sustain them. Germany was losing the ability to sustain either. The fuel question. Nothing explains mechanized warfare better than fuel. Every American tank needed it. Every truck needed it. Every aircraft needed it. Every generator needed it. The German army had fuel problems throughout the later war. Its synthetic fuel industry was increasingly targeted. Its oil supplies were limited. Transportation was damaged. And retreating German units often had to abandon vehicles simply because they could not move them. American units faced shortages too. But the United States had access to enormous fuel production and Allied supply networks. The difference became especially visible during the pursuit across France. An American armored column could keep moving because fuel trucks followed. A German column could be forced to abandon vehicles because there was no fuel to continue. A vehicle abandoned for lack of fuel was not merely a lost vehicle. It was lost mobility. And mobility was becoming the entire battle. The cost of the advance. The American advance came with a price. Thousands of American soldiers were killed and wounded during the Normandy campaign and subsequent fighting. Vehicles were destroyed. Aircraft were lost. Supply trucks were damaged. Engineers died building crossings. Infantrymen died clearing villages. Tank crews were killed inside burning vehicles. The speed of the advance did not make the war easy. It simply changed the kind of danger. In Normandy, the danger was often a machine gun hidden behind a hedgerow. During the pursuit across France, it could be an artillery ambush, a mine, a German counterattack, or a desperate rear guard. Every mile had a cost. Paris. Then came one of the most symbolic moments of the campaign. Paris. By August 1944, German control of the city was collapsing. French forces and the resistance were rising. Allied armies were approaching. The liberation of Paris became inevitable. American and Allied forces entered the city. The images were extraordinary. Crowds surrounded Allied soldiers. French flags appeared. People climbed onto vehicles. Soldiers were embraced. After 4 years of occupation, Paris was free. But militarily, the liberation of Paris was only one part of a much larger movement. The American army had pushed deep into France. The Germans were retreating toward the east. The next objective was no longer Normandy. It was Germany itself. The supply line catches up. But now the American advantage encountered its greatest enemy. Distance. The farther the army moved, the longer the supply lines became. The beaches of Normandy were hundreds of miles behind. Fuel had to travel farther. Ammunition had to travel farther. Replacement soldiers had to travel farther. Repair facilities had to move. The trucks were working harder. The roads were becoming more congested. The army had advanced so quickly that logistics struggled to keep up. This is one of the most important lessons of the campaign. Speed can create its own problems. An army can advance faster than its supply system. And when that happens, the fastest army in the world can suddenly become stationary. The Great Pivot. By late summer 1944, the American army had crossed much of France. But Germany had not surrendered. The Rhine was still ahead. The German homeland was still defended. German forces were rebuilding. Fresh formations were arriving. And the Allies had to reorganize. The pursuit slowed. The war entered another phase. The dramatic race across France had ended. But the consequences remained. Germany had lost enormous territory. Its armies had suffered catastrophic losses in Normandy. Its transportation network was badly damaged. Its western defenses were collapsing. And the Allies had established themselves firmly in Western Europe. The American advance had achieved something strategically enormous. It had transformed the Normandy invasion from a beachhead into a continental offensive. What made the Americans so fast? So what was the real answer? Why could American soldiers move so quickly across France? The answer was not simply bravery. It was not simply tanks. It was not simply Patton. And it was not simply German weakness. It was the combination. American industry produced enormous quantities of equipment. American logistics moved that equipment. American trucks carried supplies. American artillery provided firepower. American aircraft controlled the skies. American engineers kept roads and bridges functioning. American communications connected commanders. American reconnaissance found openings. American armored units exploited those openings. American infantry secured the ground. American replacements helped rebuild units. And American commanders were increasingly willing to use mobility as a weapon. The system was designed to keep functioning. That is why the advance could accelerate so dramatically once the German front broke. The real secret. There was no secret American superweapon. The secret was organization. An American soldier could fire his rifle because someone had manufactured ammunition. He could eat because someone had packed food. He could move because someone had supplied transportation. A tank could advance because someone had delivered fuel. An artillery battery could fire because shells had traveled hundreds of miles. A wounded soldier could survive because a medical system was waiting behind the front. A commander could make decisions because communications connected him to the battlefield. The speed visible on the map was actually the final product of millions of individual actions. Factory workers, ship crews, truck drivers, mechanics, engineers, medics, radio operators, pilots, infantrymen, tank crews, artillerymen, and commanders. All of them contributed to the same machine, the American way of war. The campaign in France demonstrated something fundamental about American military power. America's greatest advantage was not always an individual weapon. It was scale. The ability to put enormous quantities of resources into a theater, then sustain them, then replace them, then move them again. This did not make American soldiers invincible. They could still be ambushed. They could still be killed. They could still lose battles. But it made the American army extremely difficult to stop once it had room to maneuver. And Normandy eventually provided that room. The view from the German side. Imagine being a German soldier in August 1944. Weeks earlier, you had been fighting American infantry behind hedgerows. You believed another defensive position might stop them. Then the line breaks. Your unit begins withdrawing. You move down a road. Aircraft appear overhead. You try to hide. A bridge is destroyed. You deter. Another American column appears. You retreat again. Fuel becomes scarce. A truck breaks down. A tank is abandoned. You hear artillery. Then you hear that another town has fallen. Then another. Then another. At some point, the problem is no longer whether your unit can win the next firefight. The problem is whether your unit can survive the operational collapse around it. That was the power of Allied mobility. The Germans were being forced to respond faster than their system could respond. The difference between moving and advancing. There is a subtle difference between moving quickly and advancing effectively. An army can move quickly and accomplish nothing. True operational speed means turning movement into results. Capturing roads, capturing bridges, destroying enemy formations, cutting supply lines, forcing retreats, taking territory, maintaining your own supply system. The American army increasingly did all of these. That is why the movement across France mattered. It wasn't simply a road trip. It was the destruction of German operational freedom. Why the story matters. The campaign also offers a lesson about modern warfare. People often imagine wars as contests between weapons. Which tank is better? Which rifle is better? Which aircraft is faster? But wars are rarely decided by one weapon. They are decided by systems. The best tank is useless without fuel. The best aircraft is useless without airfields and maintenance. The best infantry division is limited without ammunition. The best commander is limited without information. And the fastest army is limited without logistics. The Americans understood this on an enormous scale. By 1944, the United States had turned industrial capacity into military mobility. And once the German defensive line broke, that mobility became devastating. The final miles across France. By the end of August 1944, the transformation was unmistakable. American soldiers who had landed on Normandy beaches less than 3 months earlier were now hundreds of miles inland. They had fought through hedgerows. They had broken German defensive lines. They had crossed rivers. They had moved through villages. They had fought German armor. They had survived artillery. They had watched comrades fall. And they had kept moving. The German army had not simply been pushed backward. It had been forced into a retreat it could no longer properly control. The map of Western Europe had changed. And the American army had demonstrated something the Germans could no longer ignore. Once a breakthrough was created, American forces could exploit it at extraordinary speed. The lasting legacy. The rapid American advance across France became one of the defining moments of the Western Allied campaign. It showed what happened when industrial power, logistics, air superiority, artillery, communications, armor, infantry, and aggressive operational planning were combined. It also showed the limits of military genius. Patton could demand speed. Eisenhower could coordinate armies. Bradley could command formations. But none of them could make an army move without the enormous infrastructure behind it. The soldiers at the front were the visible part of the machine. Behind them stood an invisible army. truck drivers, mechanics, quartermasters, engineers, signalmen, medical personnel, railway workers, port workers, factory workers, and countless others. Their work rarely appeared in photographs of liberation, but without them the photographs would never have existed. The question British officers saw. So perhaps the most interesting question isn't whether British officers literally couldn't understand the American advance. They could. The more fascinating question is what they were watching. They were watching an army whose industrial base had finally been converted into battlefield momentum. They were watching thousands of vehicles moving behind advancing divisions. They were watching artillery respond quickly. They were watching aircraft dominate the skies. They were watching German transportation collapse. They were watching commanders exploit opportunities. And they were watching a military system that could absorb enormous amounts of material and turn it into movement. The Americans weren't moving quickly because they had discovered a shortcut across France. They were moving quickly because the entire system behind the soldier was built to keep him moving. The final lesson. In the end, the American advance across France was not really a story about speed. It was a story about momentum. Momentum created by logistics. Momentum protected by air power. Momentum amplified by artillery. Momentum exploited by armor. Momentum secured by infantry. Momentum directed by commanders. And momentum sustained by an industrial base thousands of miles away. The Germans could destroy individual American tanks. They could ambush American patrols. They could counterattack. They could inflict casualties. But destroying individual pieces of the American machine was not enough. The machine itself kept replacing them. A destroyed truck could be replaced. A damaged tank could be repaired. An artillery battery could receive more ammunition. A division could receive replacements. A new convoy could arrive. And another American column could continue east. That was the real shock. The Germans were fighting an army. But increasingly they were fighting an entire system. By the time American soldiers were racing across France in the summer of 1944, the outcome of the war was not yet certain. Germany would continue fighting. The Battle of the Bulge was still months away. The Rhine had not yet been crossed. Berlin was still in the future. American soldiers would still face some of the hardest fighting of the European war. But something fundamental had changed. The German army had lost the initiative in the West. Normandy had been breached. France was being liberated. And the American army had demonstrated that once the battlefield opened, it could move with astonishing speed. Not because every American soldier was stronger. Not because every American commander was smarter. Not because American equipment was always superior. But because America had built something larger than individual weapons. It had built a military system capable of delivering enormous power across an ocean, sustaining that power thousands of miles from home, and then turning a breakthrough into a continental advance. The roads of France became the proving ground. The hedgerows were the obstacle. The German defenses were the barrier. The trucks were the bloodstream. The artillery was the hammer. The aircraft controlled the sky. The infantry held the ground. And behind everything stood American industry. Once that system began moving, stopping it became extraordinarily difficult. And that may be the most important reason the American advance across France happened so quickly. The soldiers were moving fast. But the real speed was coming from everything behind them. Factories were already working. Ships were already crossing the Atlantic. Trucks were already rolling. Fuel was already moving. Ammunition was already being loaded. Orders were already traveling through radios. Engineers were already repairing roads. And thousands of soldiers were already waiting for the next command. Advance. Move forward. Keep going. Across Normandy. Across France. Toward the German border. The American army had entered Europe. Now it was moving toward Germany. And the war had entered its final, brutal phase. The story of the American advance across France is therefore not simply the story of one army moving faster than another. It is the story of what happens when industrial power, logistics, technology, organization, and human determination come together on a battlefield. The Germans had soldiers who could fight. The British had soldiers who could fight. The Canadians had soldiers who could fight. The Americans had soldiers who could fight. But war is never decided by courage alone. The side that can keep its soldiers supplied, informed, reinforced, transported, and supported has an enormous advantage. In France, that advantage became visible. And once it became visible, the German army could no longer ignore it. The American advance was fast because the American army had learned how to make movement sustainable. And sustainable movement became unstoppable momentum. That was the real secret behind the race across France. Not one tank. Not one general. Not one battle. The system. The system built to move. And in the summer of 1944, that system moved across France. And it never stopped until it reached Germany.